Hello and welcome to Critical Thinking Lecture 5. Today we're largely going to be discussing descriptions or summary of previous content, namely descriptions of your psychological economy, you might call it, and some targets for improvement. Then we're going to discuss some strategies we've covered and then apply them with illustrative puzzles. We'll start here with descriptions and challenges. On the left you see the things that seem true about, cognition in general. And on the right column, you'll see targets for improvement. We'll start with the left. We'll walk through this briefly just to remind you. System 1 and System 2, what is this? Fast and slow thinking, right? This is just sort of an abstraction, a way of thinking about how people typically think, like at a high level. Seems like we have something like gut reactions. That's the fast responses to stimuli in the environment on the one hand, and then we have on the other colder, calculated, slower, methodical reasoning. And this seems, again, true for most people. A large feature of this course is trying to get the right gut reactions, and we can do that through careful, methodical thinking about habits. Now, moving on, we have emotions and rationality, two very important features of all of us, anyone or most people who are engaged in any sort of critical thinking. As I mentioned, for many years, and certainly in philosophy, probably still true to a large extent, rationality has been prized over emotions or affect. I think they are both very important. Emotions provide weights when we're doing the calculating with our rational faculties. And one example we discussed that illustrated why they were both important seemed to be in the work of Damasio, who was a researcher who studied people with parietal lobe damage. A paradigmatic example of that being Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, if you recall, had a railroad spike shot through his head and damaged his frontal part of his brain. Made it difficult for him to care very much about things, even though he had no trouble at all calculating. Like, he could be very strategic. His IQ was fine. Nevertheless, he had a difficult time, putting a lot of weight into the choices he made. Damasio, my favorite example from his work on this, is in fact an individual who spent way too long trying to decide whether he should come back and see Damasio and his team for a follow-up visit on either a Thursday or a Friday. He went back and forth for 45 minutes, Thursday, Friday. Couldn't weigh either way because they both seemed equally good to him. And then at some point, one of the researchers said, "Hey, how about Thursday?" And he was like, "Fine, sounds good." Again, sort of stultifying the rational calculation might be without weights associated. And that seems to be where emotions come in. We care about things, and our emotions tell us what we care about. Important to keep in mind. Now, model of cognition. Recall, we have attention. It's unfortunately, because of the way we are wired, limited. We cannot attend to everything. We get too much information from the environment, but we do focus on aspects of it. Focusing on aspects of it, we use our sort of concepts to impose structure on the things we see. There's a feedback loop because, of course, the environment gives us the structure or gives us concepts and gives us input that we then turn around and impose on it. This is, of course, stuff we learn without much intentionality. As children, right? Like we get our concepts from other people or from our culture, from our environment. I don't know where I learned the concept dog, but I know I have it and I know how to pick them out. And these things form in our, again, I'll use the term psychological economy, a sort of hierarchy of concepts, like all dogs are mammals, for instance, and these concepts are related to other concepts that we have, and this sort of structure informs the beliefs we have about the world. I believe that all dogs are mammals, right? That's part of what the concept dog entails. We also have sort of relationships among the content of desires, like I want water because it's related to satisfying thirst in a way that I believe is true. and my desires are embedded in webs, where the notion of a web for beliefs or desires illustrates embeddedness. So, like my belief that a dog is a mammal is embedded pretty deeply in a lot of other beliefs that I have. If I had to change that belief, for instance, and somehow believe that dogs are not mammals, lots of other things that I believe would have to change as well. Like I would have to go back and look at biology textbooks again, and like I'd feel like I think about how the world works in a slightly different way. On the other hand, if I had to believe that dates are not figs, because up to this point, up to a couple of days ago, I thought they were basically the same thing. If I had to change that, not a lot has to change in the rest of my web, and what goes for beliefs goes for desires. So, syntax and semantics. Of course, this is related to cognition insofar as language is related to cognition. Syntax is just like symbols and symbolic manipulations, right? Like words, like the letters D-O-G, for instance. Then the semantics, this gives meaning. That basically is meaning of those symbols, right? Like, so when I point to a dog, for instance, and use the word dog, the letters, just the structure, the shapes of those words, we know it's associated with that thing over there that I'm pointing to, namely the thing that I'm referring to. Language is, of course, this is not entirely true, but roughly speaking, useful as a tool for breaking down this booming, buzzing set of stimuli we gain from the environment into manageable chunks. Now, we also engage with the world and engage in problem solving with different types of reasoning. I discussed direct, indirect, and conditional. Remember, direct reasoning is just immediate information that you can pull out of descriptions of the world or descriptions of problems. Remember the three hats puzzle, what we knew immediately just based on how the puzzle was set up is that there were 5 hats, right? Like that just followed directly. Indirect reasoning, this is when you assume something, but you get a contradiction, and then because of that contradiction, you know you have to take your assumption back. Again, we can look at the 3 hats puzzle. If you assumed that the blind logician was wearing a certain color hat, you could determine that assumption would lead to a contradiction. Somebody would have had to be lying, but of course in the puzzle it was asserted that no one is lying. Since there were only 2 hat colors, the blind logician had to be wearing the other color. Conditional reasoning, this is the last of the 3. Conditional reasoning is when you assume something and you see what happens. This is more exploratory. I assume if my cat is hungry, then my cat will meow at me. That is a pretty reasonable assumption. She does this all the time. But it's true, right? It does seem true, namely this relationship. If the first thing, then the second thing. Now, conditional reasoning, as many of you have pointed out, it's good to note again, this is related to indirect reasoning, right? Because indirect reasoning, when you do that, you're assuming something, and you see what happens. It's just that you find a contradiction. Just general conditional reasoning is when you assume something and see what happens. You don't find a contradiction. So you know that assumption and that thing that happened based on it may in fact be true, that relationship namely. So another description of us, we are pattern recognizers. Fire is hot. You agree? Where'd you learn that? You probably got close to fire and you saw that other fire or other things that are similar enough to fire had similar properties. We see patterns all the time. This is a boon. This is something that's good. If we couldn't detect patterns, in fact, if we didn't overcompensate when we detected patterns, we'd probably be dead. Like we wouldn't have survived very long, right? Like it's good to think when you come across a stove or something hot that all things like that are going to burn you, especially if you're a child, right? It's good to form those sorts of patterns and maybe, overgeneralize. Now, that leads naturally, I think, into challenges, but we'll start at the top here, attention. Like I mentioned, we are limited in our attention. We can't see and attend to everything. When we do, we end up focusing on certain aspects of our stimuli manifold at the expense of others. This is sometimes called attentional blindness. The gorilla, if you recall, walking through a group of people throwing basketballs at one another, is a good illustration of this. You were in that task asked to count the number of times the basketball was passed to someone in the white t-shirt. Attending to that, however, made it so that you did not recognize or attend to the fact that there was a gorilla that was wandering through the group, not throwing a basketball or anything, in fact beating its chest and then wandering out of camera frame. Now, memory. We are also limited in this respect. We have roughly speaking, short, long-term, episodic memory, different types of memory. Our long-term memory, if we can get stuff encoded into it, is reasonably good and pretty stable over the lifespan. Once you get stuff in your long-term memory, or especially like crystallized information, they call it, you hold on to it for most of your life. Short-term memory is pretty fleeting. We can't really hold that much information in our short-term memory at a time. 7 plus or minus 2 when we're thinking about groups of items. That seems to be, the sort of upper bound range. Working memory is this sort of like capacity you have to hold something in your short-term memory and manipulate that information. This is also something that we are limited in our ability to do. Stress influences attention and memory, and it's easy to become stressed. Lots of things in the world stress you out. The world itself is pretty stressful, but stress can grab your attention. If you are stressed, you might attend to certain things rather than others. You may also not want to attend to anything. It might direct you away from attending in that respect. It is also associated with undermining memory encoding. So if you are very stressed out, it seems much more difficult to remember things. If you're like giving a list to remember, for instance. Limited foresight. We don't really think too hard about the future. When we do think about the future, it seems like we have a hard time putting ourselves in the future. Or you can think of this in a real world illustration as having such a hard time saving money for the future, right? Like, I know I should, you should. And if you have it, yeah, of course, do it. But right, even people who have the money to save have a difficult time saving. Why is that? It's a feature of our cognition, right? We have a difficult time thinking about the future. Even more difficult time, it seems, thinking about ourselves in the future. Delayed gratification is a struggle. Cognitive biases, these are just descriptions of sort of habits that we have in thinking that go astray or could be improved. They are challenges. For instance, anchoring bias. The example I used in class was luxury items like rings or sometimes nice furniture. Like, do you know how much a chair actually costs, or a diamond ring, with respect to like manufacturing cost and shipping and labor and stuff like that? No. Do you have an idea of how much they should cost? No. But do you know how much you're told they cost? Yeah, diamond rings are incredibly expensive. They're also marked up quite a bit, right? Like, as a matter of fact. But we are anchored to think that it's like a 2-month salary or something, right? And this is, I think, largely based on our anchoring bias. This is just assumed to be true. Availability bias, on the other hand, if we don't know much about a topic, we pull what limited sample we have from memory, and we generalize based on that information. So the number of words with K in the third position versus the number of words that start with K, for instance. Almost everyone gets this wrong when asked about the frequency, which one's greater. And the idea is that it's harder to think of representative examples of letters that have K in the third position versus that start with K. And that sort of availability informs whether you think one set is larger in number than the other. And lastly, priming, we have not talked much about. It's going to be sort of a theme of the challenges going forward. I'll save that one until we do. Also, I have here pattern recognizing. Of course, because we, as I said, we overgeneralize, or we over-represent patterns. We see patterns where they are not, and as I mentioned a minute ago, sometimes, often, in fact, that's a good thing. Fire is hot, but maybe not always. Are there so many faces in the clouds, or astrological entities in the sky? And like, probably not. So this might be examples of like overgeneralization. In any event, challenges to be observed and perhaps improved moving forward. Summary of some of the strategies. We only covered a couple, but now I'll discuss them here. On the left-hand side, we have passive strategies like meditation, leaves on a stream, loving meditation in the various rooms. And then we have NBAC, which we have focus and practice training here. These are passive in the sense that they operate in the background and are in general helpful for you as you're trying to solve problems. Meditation is going to help you stay focused as well, or present with those various examples, and helpfully focus on different types of presence. So leaves on the stream to help keeping your eye on the ball, as it were. Loving meditation, or lovingly guided meditation, help you care about yourself and pay attention to yourself and realize that you're valuable and stay confident as you're trying to solve tough problems. And then the rooms, on the other hand, help focus on how you might organize your memory in an effective way while staying present when you're trying to remember things. In back here we have focus and practice. As I mentioned, it was originally developed to help you train your working memory, although there's not a lot of evidence it does. Attention does seem to be something that it's helpful in developing. On the other hand, active strategies, these are strategies that you'll use when you're trying to solve puzzles on the fly. Like, these are intentional activities you will hopefully get in the habit of using. Representational translations, the example here being algebra and geometry. You're seeing that there's a relationship between shapes and symbols, and how you can represent both, or how you can represent the same phenomena in different ways and translate among them, because some problems are easier to solve when you are talking about it, say, in terms of shapes rather than numbers or symbol manipulations. On the other hand, visualization is a useful active strategy. Creatively imagining a phenomenon, creatively imagining a scenario and seeing what happens. It's a useful way to do some detective work about a situation. Like, I need to figure out what so-and-so was doing on the night of the 13th, blah, blah, blah. Here's all the information I have. What's most likely? Deep visualization involved there. Here, chunking. This is helpful in using the limited memory that you have and as efficiently as possible. Chunking, of course, is a strategy that plays on this plus or minus 2 upper bound range that we have for remembering items. If you group a large number of items into smaller groups, say under 7 plus or minus 2 in number, then you'll have an easier time remembering those chunks than you would, say, a long string of items or a long string of numbers. The example here being Social Security numbers, another being your phone number. It's a long string of numbers in either case, but they are grouped into smaller sets of numbers. They are chunked, as it were, and it's easy to remember them because of it. This is sort of a species of dividing and conquering. But basically, the idea is you see a tough problem. It seems too complicated to work on. It's just too many moving parts. Important strategy to get yourself in the habit of is to break it down into smaller parts as best you can, reduce it down into smaller parts, and see if you can generalize up to the larger part, or the more multifaceted structure if possible, because it's a lot easier to work with smaller parts than it is to work with an overwhelming problem. Now, this is a bit abstract, so let's look at some illustrative examples, and in particular 3 puzzles. Now, I'm going to introduce the puzzles. We'll talk more about them in class, except for the first here. I'll tell you the answer there, but we'll work on the answers in class, and I will point out in some pro tips here which of these strategies I would use or did use when I was solving these puzzles, and what I would recommend to use when you approach problems like this in the future. So start here with hanging chain puzzle. 2 flagpoles, each of them 100 feet high. tied between the tops of those poles, a 180-foot chain that dangles 10 feet off the ground at its lowest point. Your task, how far apart are the two flagpoles? Now, I will at this point give you some pro tips. Visualization. It's good to visualize. How would that work here? Well, you don't have to just sit around and think about stuff in your imagination. Maybe draw a picture. Visualize. Put that work on the pad. Another here, one that wasn't on the list, but I'll be adding to the list after this puzzle, is boundary checking. This is new. You should think about what happens at the maximum distance of the flagpoles and the minimum distance of the flagpoles. I'll let you think about that for a moment. Pause if you don't want me to continue. But if you're okay with me moving on, here we go. As I said, boundary checking is your friend here. What is the maximum distance the two flagpoles could be apart? Well, 180 feet, since there's a 180-foot chain between them. The chain would be stretched 100 feet from the ground at every point if it were stretched out that way. Okay, that's one boundary. What's the minimum distance the two flagpoles could be apart? 0 feet. All right, the two flagpoles are next to each other. And you could, of course, visualize this. You could draw this out and see it. Now, the 180-foot chain would dangle down 90 feet on each side. But look, that's 10 feet off the ground, right? And so the two flagpoles have to be right next to each other. Now, hopefully you see that, right? But we basically solved the puzzle by checking the boundaries. And I would encourage you to use this puzzle as a paradigmatic example of boundary checking, because checking the boundaries in this case did, in fact, solve the puzzle. Now, you should always check boundaries. I always do. But remember, this is how it works. Next puzzle, blue eyes. This is where we left off in a previous discussion. We will pick it up when we meet again. Here's the puzzle. There's an island. 1,000 people live on it, various eye colors. Religion forbids them to know or discuss their own eye color. Each resident knows the eye colors of all others, but not his or her own. If anyone discovers his or her own eye color, the religion compels them to leave the island at noon the next day in front of everyone. All of the inhabitants are logical and devout. As a matter of fact, 100 have blue eyes and 900 have brown eyes. One day, a blue-eyed foreigner visits the island and says how unusual it is to see another blue-eyed person. What effect, if anything, does this faux pas have on the tribe? Pro tips. Translate this, right? It's too hard to think about this in terms of actual people. Maybe it would be easier if you thought about, translating this puzzle into a more easily digestible symbolic representation. And of course, boundary check. This is the new one. Now, I will move on to the birthday puzzle because, as I said, we will discuss the blue eyes puzzle in class. Here we have Albert Bernard want to know Cheryl's birthday. She gives them 10 possible dates. Here they are: May 15th, 16th, and 19th, June 17th, 18th, July 14th and 16th, August 14th, 15th, and 17th. Now, those are the possible dates. Cheryl then tells Albert the month, just the month, and tells Bernard just the day. And then the following exchange occurs. Albert says, I do not know Cheryl's birthday. I know Bernard doesn't know. Bernard says, okay, at first I didn't know, but now I do. And Albert says, now I know. Your challenge, when? When's the birthday? Here's some pro tips. Visualization, once again. You might want to draw don't have to draw flagpoles in this one, of course, but maybe draw columns and rows. Start slotting in dates. Divide and conquer. Break this down into manageable parts. And they may be manageable groups of months, manageable groups of dates, and think about those parts. And boundary checking, of course. Think about the minimum cases. Think about the maximum cases within those, groupings of months or groupings of days. All right. Remember, boundary checking is new. We'll talk more about that. This, like all of these puzzles, should illustrate its importance. And I'll see you soon.